Thank you so much, Jennifer, and I appreciate you all who have attended today. I see a lot of familiar names, and so I hope we can have some good discussion today about seed bulking and seed transfer zones. Oops, sorry. Okay, so we're going to just start with a little outline just so you know where we're headed. I'm going to start off with just a little bit of background and introduction into thinking about seed-based restoration. And then first we'll start off with seed production, thinking primarily about seed bulking, seed increase, or seed amplification, all terms used to increase the availability of seed through cultivation processes, and then we'll dip into some information about seed transfer zones. And so just to give you all a little bit of background on where I'm coming from, I am coming to you today from the California Botanic Garden, which is home of the California Seed Bank. The California Seed Bank is located in Los Angeles County, Southern California, and we are the largest seed bank dedicated to California native plants. Our seed bank holds primarily smaller research-sized collections. It was not built for restoration collections. That wasn't the primary reason why we started our seed bank back in the 1980s. However, restoration seed banking is becoming increasingly important in our programs as restoration is becoming increasingly important in our society. So it's something we're looking more to in the future, and we are learning about restoration seed banking along with the rest of you all here. And so our seed bank is really composed primarily of smaller collections, and we have a high diversity of collections. Over 2,200 taxa are represented. And there are nearly 6,000 accessions in our seed bank. And so while these collections are fairly small, we are moving towards some restoration seed banking, primarily partnering with the Angeles National Forest. We've been a seed banking collecting team for quite a long time with the Bureau of Land Management and the Seeds of Success program. So we have a lot of experience on the collecting front and are getting more experience in the seed cultivation front. And so I think that restoration really benefits from a lot of expertise, really diverse perspectives coming together to really benefit ecosystems. So we have botanists, ecologists, growers, practitioners, and land managers all coming together towards this common cause of restoration. And I just want to mention this as myself trained as a botanist, a plant systematist, a person who thinks about plant diversity, plant geography on the landscape. I oversee a program that implements restoration on the ground in a number of different aspects. So we operate fundamentally as practitioners, but we also participate from the angle of research. And so one of the things I feel we're always trying to do here is to really bring together and bridge the gap between research and implementation so that knowing doing gap, which is all too present in a lot of aspects of conservation and restoration biology. And so I'm hoping that the talk presented here today, the information presented, can facilitate some of those discussions about the knowing and doing gap, to bridge that gap between knowing and doing, and help us move forward in our restoration practice. So I encourage lots of questions and discussions today in the end, and hopefully facilitating information exchange. And I say this to let you know that this was a really great process for me to put together this presentation. I learned a lot. I read a lot of papers and kind of took a deep dive. This seed cultivation and the research surrounding seed transfer zones is not my particular research expertise, but it's something I've thought about a lot through my time as a plant conservation biologist. And so I'm presenting to you today lots of other people's research and kind of a synthesis, I think, of some, core things that we know or areas that I hope will help move us forward in thinking about how to advance restoration of wildlands. So on to our introduction to seed conservation. So we're all here, and I think it's easy to say that probably all of us appreciate native plants. and understand that they are foundational to ecosystems on Earth, on land. They provide us with so much, and they support biodiversity in many ways, and they are underpin our regulatory earth systems like clean air, water, nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, all these things, and really contribute to our culture and our health and well-being. So cannot underestimate a plant and or underscore just how important they are in our lives, and that really drives home how important restoration is. And so because plants are so important, we have a tremendous need for seed to advance these restoration efforts. And we know that restoration is a critical action as a part of nature-based solutions to address the twin crises of climate change and the biodiversity extinction crisis. We're seeing accelerating disturbance due to anthropogenic change, diverse land use, a lot of it occurring on public lands like mining, industrial scale solar. I have photographed here Palin Solar Project on BLM land out in the Colorado desert, logging, grazing, and a lot of this facilitates invasive species. So there's a lot going on at this time in our lives. We live in a very important time in human history and civilization, as we are experiencing also ecosystem disruption due to climate change. We're experiencing incredible droughts, mega droughts that haven't been seen in human history, altered fire regimes, severe flooding, just very intense heat. I am here in Southern California, where we just experienced a week of over 100-degree temperature for multiple days, very anomalous high temperatures. So I went and downloaded this map to look at mean daily temperature anomaly for the last 7 days. This is current as of yesterday, the last 7 days across the West. And we could see that we're experiencing unprecedented warming across the West. So this is, plants have a lot to contend with, as well as within our own lives. So it became even more real the other day when 3 fires broke out in Southern California. This is a picture taken from Los Angeles just the other day of the bridge fire, which is burning right now in the San Gabriel Mountains. And so climate change is here, and it's going to disrupt and alter our ecosystems. And there's a lot we're going to have to do to get to work to help support and restore these ecosystems, because while fire can be a very restoring process, it can also, under climate change scenarios, be a very destructive process that harms ecosystems and really could impact the landscape. This particular area that's burning right now, these are some of the ecosystems that are being impacted. Here on this side is a beautiful forest, one of the best forests I've ever seen, a Pseudotsuga macrocarpa bighorn spruce. I'm afraid that has burned, and I don't know what the condition will be. That's not a species that is particularly fire adapted. It's poorly fire adapted. And so we could see tremendous loss in this area. And here is just some incredible chaparral, being a very fire adapted vegetation type, but under these very hot conditions, we don't really know how it will recover. And so I feel like we're in new territory here. A lot of things are changing, and so it just makes the work we're doing in restoration seem that much more urgent, and we have to rapidly get our act together and ensure we have a seed supply so that we can support these landscapes. So that really calls us to think about restoration as a form of reciprocity for nature, that this is essential work for caring for and managing the land. And this quote really speaks to me from Melissa K. Nelson from this book, Traditional Ecological Knowledge, Learning from Indigenous Practices for Environmental Sustainability, where she says, "Whatever we do to the land, which is our source of life, we do to ourselves." And so the health of these incredible systems really, if we're able to make them healthy, they can make us healthy. But we know we have a lot of challenges to seed-based restoration. For one is that the wild seed themselves that we collect from wild populations can be very limited in their availability, especially under these changing climate conditions, experiencing intensive heat, increased drying. We've been collecting seeds in the Mojave Desert ecoregion since 2010. And up until I would say the year 2019 or 2020, every year we've been able to successfully make many seed collections across the landscape. And then when the drought set in, really starting in 2020 until multi-year drought until 2023, there were a couple of years there where we weren't able to find these very common populations. We weren't able to find fruit. We were very limited in the amount of seed we were able to collect across this hugely intact landscape. Creosote bush, very common shrub, not producing any seed. And so we know that we're going to potentially have a hard time securing some of these seeds. So in those good years, it's really imperative that we can make that happen. At restoration sites, when you're doing seed-based restoration, oftentimes you also get low seedling establishment. So that can just be a real challenge, making sure you have the quantity of seed you need so you can have success. And that it's just one of the things we're going to talk about is seed sourcing and making sure that we have the right match to the environment. And with the changing climate, that can be even more challenging. So making sure that there isn't mismatch in the environment and that your plants are adapted to your restoration site. And so a lot of practices in seed conservation and restoration are adapted from agriculture, especially, related to seed cultivation. And so these are two very different they have to do two very different goals, agricultural systems compared to restoration in wildlands, where agriculture seeks uniformity and consistency. And in restoration, we seek to maintain variation. And we have these uncontrolled, environments. We need plants to be able to adapt. So adapting these methods towards restoration can be challenging, but we need to be innovative and we need to think of ways that we can maximize variation and ensure that we have the materials that we need for future restoration. And there's a lot of benefits to collecting seed, saving seed, ensuring you have a sufficient seed supply. And seeds have natural dormancy. They can be long-lived, and we can ensure our future by collecting and saving seed. They're this insurance policy against the loss of diversity in wild. They're the raw materials needed for restoration, and they teach us so much about plants. To collect seed, you might learn about seed predators, seed viability. When you're doing germination trials and propagating plants and cultivating seed, we might learn a lot about life history attributes of wild species. So all along the way through the restoration effort, we're really learning about ecosystems, and it's going to help us be better in the future. So collecting this data is really important. So today, there's a lot of steps along the way to restoration. These are just some of the steps. These are not all the steps. But, we start with wild seed collection. Maybe we need to take that base wild seed collection and increase it to make it available for restoration. And then when we're going to implement a restoration, we're looking at the seed that's available that we have and sourcing the seed needed for restoration. And there's a lot of decisions in that. So we're going to be talking about this seed increase and seed sourcing steps towards restoration. So we're going to start off with seed production and cultivating seed for restoration. So here we have this incredible ecosystem out in the Mojave Desert. This is a dune ecosystem filled with sand verbena, desert lilies, and evening primrose. Here's just some photos of the Abronia villosa, desert sand verbena. Enothera deltoides, the birdcage evening primrose. This is it in its fruiting phase, or actually the year after its fruiting phase, where it makes the beautiful cage. And then this is Hesperocallis undulata, the desert lily. And I kind of just bring up this diversity when we think about restoration and we're thinking about communities. There's these individual species that are components of these plant communities, and they each have their own individual histories, evolutionary histories that they bring to these environments. And they've been evolving, for millions of years, and there's a lot of variation kind of tied up in those many years of evolution. The deserts are somewhat young, and perhaps these ecosystems have assembled just a few tens of thousands of years ago. But the lineages that these species belong to are have experienced millennia of years of evolution, and it just to capture that and to be able to restore that, that's a lot of work. That's a big challenge, but that's what we're tackled with, and that's what we must do to ensure that they have resilience in the future so they can live the next million years. They've faced through this time, they have faced climate change, the warming environment, and so that there's a lot for them that they've contended with in the past that will help them move them to the future. And so in these environments, we're out there, we're collecting seed. This is a seed collection from one of our seeds, from our Seeds of Success team. They did a lot of seed collections this year of Salvia columbare. And so we're collecting these baseline seed collections to support ecosystems like this. This is a restoration site that my team is working on in the Angeles National Forest. This is degraded chaparral down here in the flat area. You can see that there are intact shrublands up on the slope, but there's a lot that can be done here to improve the situation where you have invasive mustard and grasses and not a lot of native plant diversity. It's not as beneficial for wildlife. It's not as beneficial for carbon sequestration. It is kindling for fire. And so there's a lot that can be improved here through the restoration process. So there's just a lot of management and tending that would need to happen, and getting sufficient quantity of seed. If you were to implement seed-based restoration here, you'd really need sufficient, an ample quantity of seed. So we have this challenge of scaling up. How do we scale up our restoration efforts? We have the goals. We have to select the appropriate species. Within those species, we want to maintain high levels of genetic diversity. We want to pick the right, match the right populations with the right sites to ensure plant establishment and that they can be resilient in a changing climate. But we have a lot of constraints. We have limited seed availability. Either the seed for that species is not available because no one has made those collections yet. So you have to go find those source populations and make those collections, or the seed that is available is not a sufficient quantity to support restoration. And then we also have the constraint. We need to recognize that when we do find a really great population that supports seed collection, that repeated collections from wild populations can have a detrimental effect to those wild populations. So it's really important that we're not over collecting from the wild, and that we find ways to supply the seeds that are needed at the restoration site. And so there's various strategies that we can employ to supply seed for restoration. So like I mentioned before, the first thing we always start with is collecting seed from natural populations. So these strategies come from this paper. I'm going to be citing a lot of other people's work, and I have references and lists at the end. But this comes from a paper from Pedrini et al., where they mention ways in which we can kind of ensure we have sufficient seed, and maybe ensure those seeds are genetically diverse, but also what are the methods we can use that maybe move a little bit away from using natural source populations towards increasing seed production. And one of those ways is harvesting from more managed populations. And so I'm going to discuss that a little bit later, like what does that look like? What is a managed population? And then there's cultivating seeds or establishing native seed farms. And then perhaps there's a combination of all the above, where we're utilizing diverse sources of seed for restoration. So in this article by Pedrini et al., they have this really nice figure that shows some of the pros and cons to these different seed sourcing methods. When we're working with natural populations, the inputs are very low. We're not, cultivating them. They're just maturing naturally in the wild, but it is somewhat resource intensive in that it's labor intensive, right? To get a very small quantity of seed, you're going to have a lot of work by a lot of people. And so the seed price for natural populations is much higher than it was if you can generate more seed in a cultivated setting and lower the seed cost. Also scalability, it's not very scalable to collect seed from natural populations, and you can really increase the scale if you move into a more cultivated environment. But there's some trade-offs. For one is we might lose genetic representation from the donor population in the cultivated setting. So that's a big thing to consider, especially when we're thinking about climate change, and we really don't want to lose genetic variation. However, cultivating these plants can reduce damage to natural populations, so we're not over collecting, and it can also be a form of efficiency. So there's just a lot of trade-offs for either, all along the way, natural population to cultivated population. So they're just things we need to think about as we identify a strategy that is appropriate for our project. So when we think about managed populations, what are we talking about? So a managed population might be, it is a wild population, but perhaps at that wild population, we're doing work including habitat enhancement, such as weed removal. Perhaps we're augmenting the population with some plantings to enhance genetic diversity, to increase pollinator visitation, and maybe increase reproduction and increase seed output. And maybe we're doing some irrigation or adding other inputs to increase resource availability, so plants are able to produce more seed. And then maybe we're also fencing. Maybe we're excluding herbivores and seed predators to make sure that more seed comes towards the restoration rather than to some of the wildlife in the environment. So those are all things that can be considered. I personally, me and my team have not, I don't think, full on engaged in seed collection for managed populations, but it's something we've discussed or thought about, especially with respect to rare plants. We do a lot of rare plant seed banking at the California Botanic Garden, and there are certain rare plants that have been incredibly impacted by drought, where you can watch them year after year after year, and they're not producing seed. And there's a feeling of urgency. You need the seed, you need to do work to help restore these populations. So one idea is to water these plants to get them to generate seed. So that's something that we have explored with respect to certain rare plants, especially in the desert. A particular rare plant population that occurs on military lands in the Mojave Desert that actually has been done in the past, and they had successful seed production, increase in seed production. And then there's seed cultivation. So this is the end of the spectrum, towards implementing sort of like putting wild plants into an agricultural system. But seed production methods, these were able to really increase seed. It's much more scalable, and but there's a lot of important considerations. We need to make sure we're maintaining evolutionary processes and ecological function. So when we think about the collection process for native plants, we're doing a lot to potentially reduce genetic variation from the collection process to the cultivation process. And we've kind of narrowed the genetic variability, but then we're going to release that seed back into the wild, where it's going to experience a whole wide range of environmental variation. So they need to be able to adapt. They need to be able to come out of the cultivated environment and be successful for many generations. So there's just a balance there. And there's also considerations with other interactions with other species. If we alter these plants too much and they're going out to a restoration site where they're cross-pollinating with wild plants of the same species, we don't want those negative effects to kind of propagate throughout populations. So just a lot of considerations. So there's this really great paper by Ledger et al. Published in 2021, and this is a table adapted from that. And this is the idea that seeds undergoing cultivation for seed farming could develop what's called domestication syndrome, or basically traits that you see in agronomic species start showing up in these wild species just after a few generations. And so, for instance, in agricultural systems, agricultural species, we find that there's a lack of dormancy, you have rapid germination. Whereas native plants, a trait associated with native plants is you have high seed dormancy and staggered germination. Oops, sorry. And then in agricultural systems, plants could be very fast growing, native plants, they're slower growing. And so basically, when we see our native plants developing these agricultural traits, we know that there's genetic change happening. We're possibly selecting for traits that are associated with domestication syndrome. And this is something we really want to avoid. Agricultural plants have uniform growth. It's very uniform, and their time to seed maturity is like, you want to harvest all at the same time. You don't want to have to harvest at multiple times in the year. And we know when we're collecting seed that we might have to go back multiple times if we want to get the full range of genetic variation out there. And so we want to, and that's what plants do. They like have ripening that happens throughout a season. In agricultural systems, you get seed retention and loss of seed appendages, so the plants hold on to their seed. Whereas a native plant trait is more for plants to disperse their seed out and to have larger seed appendages. And then you oftentimes get selection for increased seed size in agricultural plants, high seed production, etc. And so, how do we minimize sort of a de-wilding of these plants and ensure that they are not full-on domesticated plants that then can't adapt in the wild? And so there's this article by Pisa et al. 2021 that really has this really great graph that I think captures this idea. And we can envision how this process of the loss of genetic diversity through time. So we start with a wild population, and we see that there, from early to late, there's a season, there's differential ripening throughout the season. And unfortunately, we're not able to collect through the whole entire season. So at the propagular collection point, we're already losing genetic diversity where we've collected a certain segment of diversity when we made our seed collection at a certain point in time. So that's this row right here. We've made our seed collection here. And so we've gotten this, but we lost this because that happened earlier, right? Now we propagate these plants, and so the plants are growing in a production farm. We've harvested the seed. We've captured this amount of diversity, but we lost these bits at the end. And so we're losing diversity sort of like with every step in the process. And by the time we're planting at the restoration site, we have this, seed, but there was some amount of genetic diversity that's no longer present here that would have been more favored at the restoration site that we've lost. So how do we prevent that from happening? So there have been a number of studies that have looked at these consequences to seed bulking. And so I went and found as many as I could. There weren't as many as I would like. I would like to see more of these kinds of studies, but there's some interesting diversity of studies that you look at different kinds of data and take place in different parts of the world. And I think they tell kind of similar stories. So this particular study, Conradi et al. 2023, they looked at phenotypic traits of 19 different species, and they looked at it across 4 generations. They found increased size and reproduction. They found lower within species variability, and they found more synchronized flowering. So those are signs of domestication syndrome that they're finding. So, right, signs of crop domestication syndrome within a few generations. This is a study that took place in Europe. This Nagel et al. Paper, they looked at AFLP genetic markers. They looked at 5 grassland species. They looked at 2 to 4 generations and found significant genetic changes in 3 of the 5 species that they looked at. So their take-home message was that seed bulking can cause evolutionary change. The Pisa et al. Story looked at phenotypic traits for one species, a species of Clarkia, in response to drought stress. It looked at 8 generations. The farmed plants were taller, they had larger stigmatic surfaces, and higher mortality when exposed to drought. So meaning that they probably, in a changing climate, were not as highly adapted. So the take-home message there is that bottlenecks and selection reduce genetic diversity, and in a changing climate, that's really difficult for us to contend with. So that's a US Midwestern Clarkia species. There is a study that California Botanic Garden, in partnership with the Center for Plant Conservation and many gardens as a part of the California Plant Rescue, are participating in. And we're looking at seed bulking process. We're looking at it with respect to rare plants, but I think it would have application to other wild species regardless. We're gathering genetic data we're going to be looking at SNPs. And for 2 species, we're gathering genetic data. And for 15 species, we're looking at phenotypic traits. And we're going to be looking at it across 2 generations. So we don't have our data yet. We actually just implemented our first year of seed bulking and growing. So we've collected data, but you can stay tuned for what our takeaway messages are for that study. So major takeaways with thinking about seed bulking. I think there's a lot of different needs, right, for seed bulking, and people a lot of people, they're looking for higher quantities of seed, but we're trying to balance a lot of different needs here. So I think cooperation and collaboration between a lot of different people working at different aspects of this are going to really enhance the work. So you have growers and restoration practitioners and researchers hopefully working together to identify ways that we can innovate to prevent domestication syndrome, to maintain genetic variation, and ensure we have what we need for restoration sites in a changing climate. And we may just be limiting ourselves in our restoration goals if we're really constraining plants and their genetic variation in terms of what they're going to be able to do in a changing climate. All right, so that was some takeaways on seed bulking, and now I want to move into seed transfer zones, which really gets at thinking about seed sourcing and how do we identify what seed is the right seed for our particular site. So seed transfer zones are geographical areas or zones within which we feel that we can move seed around with very little risk of maladaptation. This will ensure that plants are adapted to the local environment. And they may also be used to identify locations for future movement for maybe assisted migration or future climate resilience, depending on how you're doing your seed sourcing, what you're looking at, and so we're going to kind of discuss that a little bit later. Oops. But we know some things, and some of this is seminal work that was done. Here's a study from 1948 from Klazenkeck and Heisey, a very classic study that showed across a very narrow spatial scale, but across a very steep elevational gradient, you have a lot of ecotypic variation. And so a single species in a common garden setting could display huge amounts of variation that maybe, seed from the Mather site is not adapted to be moved to seed from the Tuolumne Meadow site, or various sort of moving around. So we know that there is at narrow spatial scales a lot of variation that maybe shouldn't be moved around. For one, non-local genotypes may be maladapted to the restoration site, and it might reduce success. And non-local genotypes may affect adjacent native populations through gene flow. And so there is a reason why Many restoration practitioners still to this day focus on locally adapted, regionally appropriate native plant materials. But there are other ways of looking at it and maybe there are different additional tools being developed that can help us ensure that in a changing climate, we're identifying the best seed for the site. So these are the Bauer seed zones. The Bauer seed zones were developed based on high resolution climate data. This is seed zones for the whole entire continental United States. The climate data used include winter minimum temperatures and aridity classified into these discrete bands. So they developed these 64 provisional zones based on the climatic similarity, but then also overlaid Ulmerich level 3 ecoregions on top of that. And when you superimpose that, then you can distinguish areas that are similar climate-wise, but very different ecologically, so that you can identify, sort of separate out areas that are similar climate-wise, but you wouldn't want to necessarily transfer the seed between them because there's in different ecoregions. So that's one way of looking at provisional seed zones. But we can also develop what are called empirical seed zones. And so empirical seed zones benefit from experimental data. It's not just sort of modeling climate or overlaying ecoregions and matching. So this is a color matching process. You know, you're in your particular seed zone and you would move around within that same color. But if you can develop empirical seed zones, that really benefits from experimental work like common gardens and or developing landscape genomics projects, where in a common garden, you can evaluate plants that are collected from different regions but grown at the same site to see what kind of phenotypic variation is maintained at the garden site, and if certain plants are not adapted to that site and maybe they've been moved too far. And then landscape genomics helps us identify patterns of genetic variation across the landscape. And maybe that's another indicator of how, you know, indicating gene flow and how plants can be moved around across the landscape. So there was a common garden study published in 2023 by Nolan et al. Called Rethinking Local Seed Sourcing for the Restoration of Foundational Grass Species in California. This looked at the California state grass, Dipolpulchra purple needlegrass. So they established 3 common gardens across this latitudinal gradient, and they used 7 wild collected source populations. And what they found is that the distance between seed source and common garden did not have a significant effect on growth or reproduction. And what they recommend as a result of their paper is a regional admixture seed sourcing strategy for this particular species. So that was to say that you're collecting seed for the restoration project from many distinct populations, but that exist within a defined regional area. So you're not like necessarily doing it across the whole state of California, but perhaps it's in a more constrained regional area, but you're mixing these different seed sources. And the idea behind that is that you're increasing genetic diversity, and that's expected to help populations be successful over a wider range of environmental conditions. That's one approach. And then you have, this is just an example of landscape genetics. This was a study done on Hilaria jamesii, another grass, which found just showed like what are the major populations, how is genetic diversity partitioned across the landscape. And so maybe instead of using ecoregions, you can use other forms of data to kind of partition and identify these different zones. And just to note that both Stephenpulchra and Hilaria jamesii, these are grasses, they're wind pollinated, they might have pretty high gene flow across the landscape relative to other insect pollinated plants. So you might have totally different results with certain insect pollinated species than you might say with wind pollinated species. So I think taking into account life history is also really important in these studies. and thinking about what species to choose to implement these studies. If you're looking at it, you're wanting to look at some important restoration species and develop empirical seed zones for important restoration species in your region. If you're able to choose multiple species and do research, you might want to choose these different life history strategies. But in the absence of having empirical seed zones, perhaps there's still information we can gather on species to help us in this work. So Arlie Montalvo, when she was with the Riverside Corona Resource Conservation District, she developed these species profiles. And these species profiles summarize a lot of valuable information on these species, but help you maybe kind of determine like what are the constraints of this species in terms of moving it around. And she also, so she has specific sections on seed sourcing, and she also, along, I believe, Erin Reardon helped with these projected future suitability habitat maps under changing climate conditions. And so there's these different projected suitable habitats based on different scenarios. And so that can also perhaps inform, adaptation into the future. So aside from doing these empirical studies, there's perhaps other information that can be gathered too that can just help inform how species may or may not be moved around. And so we know that certain species just have a lot of genetic variation. And patterns of genetic variation can really differ. So when you have species with strong genetic differentiation over small geographic scales, perhaps those should not be moved very far. But for instance, species with less genetic differentiation, like maybe some of these wind-pollinated grasses, maybe they can be moved across a relatively large area. I'm using here bush monkey flower as an example of perhaps a species or species complex for which there is strong genetic differentiation across smaller spatial scales. One thing we know is with bush monkey flower is that once upon a time, not very long ago in 1993, the entire variation of this group was considered a single species, Mimulus aurantiacus or Diplacus aurantiacus. And during that time, the species is readily available in cultivation, was used very frequently in roadside projects, and frequently moved around. And taxonomists later here in 2012, Tulig and Neeson published this paper that resurrected a lot of these ecotypes to the level of species. And we see that there's a lot of ecogeographic variation. There's a lot of variation in flower color, plant size, leaf characteristics, hairiness, all these sorts of things that likely indicate aspects of local adaptation. And a lot of these plants occur across relatively small geographies. And so we see the effects of that to this day in the horticultural trade and in restoration projects, where at the California Botanic Garden, we are given plant lists all the time for Southern California that will say that they want Diplacus aurantiacus, which is the species that everything was lumped into prior on their list, and that's not a species native to Southern California. That is a species that occurs up closer to the more northern coast and central coast of California. So these are all things to consider, and taxonomy shifts and changes, but it's really important to consider the species biology and just figure out what we know and ensure that we're not mixing things that perhaps will be then maladapted for a particular environment. So there's these lots of different ways to source seeds for a particular restoration site. So one is just local seed sourcing. That's kind of like the baseline, what a lot of people have traditionally done, which is to source the seed as close as possible to the restoration site. So this assumes that the environmental conditions closer to the site is better for establishment, and it preserves, biotic interactions. And then there is all these different other kinds of seed sourcing, including climate adjusted seed sourcing. So under climate adjusted seed sourcing, we might be supplementing the local seed collection with seeds collected along a climate gradient, and that are, when we're thinking about future climate change, so that we're introducing genetic diversity for the projected future climate, but also maintaining the local seed. So that's kind of adjusting based on the climate. So it's part local, part not local, right? And then there's genetic seed sourcing, and that is based on seed transfer zones based on patterns of gene flow. So that just might be much broader, more encompassing, depending on the genetic patterns of the species. And then there's predictive seed sourcing, which is more climate matching. So you're collecting seed from an area that is predicted to have similar climate conditions for future climate, may or may not include local seed, right? So that would be different from climate adjusted seed sourcing, which includes local seed. And then there's the admixture seed sourcing, which the STIPA study recommended, which is to combine seed collections from different sources within a regional area to increase genetic diversity and adaptive potential. And then there's composite seed sourcing. And composite seed sourcing combines collections from different sources to mimic natural gene flow to increase genetic diversity and adaptive potential. So some of these are really similar, and there's just like little nuances about how they're different, but they're all like different ways to think about seed sourcing. And I'm sure people have like lots of different perspectives about what to do. A lot of the work my team does, we still really focus on a lot of local seed sourcing. I think it seems like the safest thing to do until we have like very clear information that we should be doing something otherwise. Thinking that even plants at the local level perhaps have adaptations, thinking about climate change. And so then there's all these tools that are also being developed, these seed mappers, seed zone mappers, that can be used to help identify places where to put your seed. And so I have these links here. This presentation will be up. I'm going to also put the actual physical presentation will be uploaded, available for download, so you can like copy and paste these. And so these are things just to try out and give a try. A lot of resources being put into developing these kinds of tools. So I just want to share that I have a whole series of PDFs and references. These are the seed bulking references, and these are the seed zone references. And so I'll be sharing that. And I know probably a lot of people on this call might be involved, maybe with the California Native Plant Society native seed strategy, and that there is like a site where we can upload information. So I'll be sharing this with Caroline from this California Native Plant Society for people to have access to these articles. This, like I said, this presentation will be available so you can copy, paste, and search for these articles. And with that, I thank you. And that's my presentation for today. And I'm happy to take questions. It looks like we probably have some questions from the audience.
Yes, we definitely do. So I wanted to start with just a comment from somebody who said that this was so well framed on the why we need to move on this. So thank you for giving that introduction to why this is important. We do have quite a few questions. So one that came in is about domestication syndrome. So how fast can that happen?
I think it really varies by species, but some of the studies have found that within 2 generations, you might be seeing signs of domestication syndrome. So I'm really interested in this with respect to the project that we have with the California Plant Rescue. We're looking just at 2 generations. So we want to see, we are measuring these various traits like seed size and time to flowering and these sorts of things. And it's a big concern of mine, especially with respect to rare plants. For all species, it's a concern. But I think that it could happen more rapid than we think, and that we really need a lot more data on it. As you can see, like I presented a few set of studies. I'd love to know if people know of other papers that I just haven't come across. But I think this is like an important point to think about when we initiate our seed farm site. We need to, rapidly increase the quantity and supply of seeds. But we also want ecosystems, and it's not like developing crops is not the same as having wild species.
Great, thank you, Naomi. So speaking of the study that you're doing, we had a question about what 2 species is your bulking study focused on?
So the 2 species for genetics, that's a good question. So Acanthomintha ilicifolia is a rare species that we are working on for the genetic study. The other species was to be a Deinandra. So one of the interesting things about this process is sometimes we're seed bulking species that have never been seed bulked before, and they present us with challenges. And so we're having a lot of difficulty actually with our second species. We had very poor success, and we didn't have enough tissue actually for the genetic study. So we're really sorting through the second species actually. But yeah, Acanthomintha ilicifolia is one for sure. And then we have a number. So one of the interesting things just about that project is that we're not only looking at these different traits and we're gathering genetic data, but we're also testing growing sites. So the California Plant Rescue is a network of botanic gardens all throughout California. And so we're looking at coastal and inland species, and we are have coastal and inland gardens. So we're also matching according to climate. So we're growing the inland species at an inland garden and a coastal garden, and the coastal species at a coastal garden and an inland garden. So we're kind of matching, and we're seeing about bulking success related to distance to actual the native site where the plants are from.
Great. Okay, another question. So do you have any thoughts or concerns about the commercial growing production of California native plants? So it says these plants are largely grown for more urban situations, but California has such a large wildland and urban interface statewide. And do you have any thoughts about reducing genetic variability or the reduced fitness or resilience of these plants coming from the commercial stream?
It's a really good question. And, there's this real large gradient of how native plants are utilized on the landscape. And I think about that, especially with respect to being a person living in Los Angeles. And I'm also a member of a group called Seed LA. And we're thinking a lot about how we can amplify the availability of seed across the Los Angeles region, especially when we're dealing with very small populations. So we're dealing with these like native plant populations of common species that are essentially legacy populations, and they can be really small and hard to source seed from. I think that in the more built environment, those plants might have different needs in terms of what they need to be adapted for. Like, the soils are different, experiencing urban heat island effect. And it might be and dealing with sprinklers and like irrigation that isn't experienced in the wild. So there might be a set of conditions that actually is not the same as something that wild plants need to contend with, that maybe certain aspects of cultivation might make those plants more successful in the built environment. But then at the same time, yes, there's this urban wildland interface. But I would like to think or hope that the wild plants and wild populations wouldn't be swamped out by what's present in the urban environment, but I don't know. But yeah, that's something, I think about. I don't know that I have any good answers to it, but it'd be a great research project if anyone's.
All right, thanks, Naomi. Another question for you. So besides diverse spatial and temporal collection, what mitigations are there for issues associated with bulking?
I think, well, one is, if we had more studies, maybe we would know. And I wonder, studies specifically targeted towards how can we limit say domestication syndrome, how can we innovate to ensure that we keep as much genetic diversity as possible? Some of that might be limiting the number of generations that we take. I think the more we increase the number of generations that plants reside in cultivation, the more chance we have of going more towards domestication syndrome. Perhaps in our cultivation process, we could think about ways to help stimulate germination of diverse genotypes and not select inadvertently for particular genotypes that are suited to growing in the nursery environment. So how can we stimulate germination across a long time period? We know in the nursery setting, a lot of times our team, they're germinating seed and they have these seed flats and you get maybe a flush of germination and then you wait and you wait and you get another flush of germination, that these things can continually germinate along a long time span. So I think we need to give plants time to germinate and think about how we can maximize the genetic diversity that we're including in those seed farms.
All right. And a question about admixtures. So are admixtures recommended for native grass species and other wind-pollinated species? Is that where you...
Well, it was in that particular study for Stipropulchra. I don't know that that other bunch grasses in California necessarily would follow the same pattern. And I think that's a thing about empirical seed zones. It's like, how far do they transfer out? Like, can we apply that to other species? Does that apply only to that species? I think we need a lot more data on a lot more species to be able to see what kind of patterns we see across different groups of plants exhibiting different life histories across different families, and so forth.
All right, and another question on domestication syndrome. So do you think cultivated seeds that have domestication syndrome, so like once you see that, is there a way to revert back?
Oh, I really don't know. I don't know. Maybe. That would be an interesting, I don't know. The thing is, well, at least in one study, in the Pisa et al. Study, they had high mortality under drought conditions. So if you try to revert them back and kind of get them to experience a wider range of environmental conditions, you might just have high mortality, unfortunately, but I'm not really sure. I don't know if anyone's really tried to do that.
Okay, great. I'm going to try and get this question right. It's got a lot of content into it. So referring to different ways to delineate and define seed zones can be confusing. And they name a couple of, I believe, different ways of naming seed zones. So is there one that we should go by? Is it, known to be better to match site characteristics as opposed to going by distance? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, I don't know that there's a one size fits all. I think there's all these different approaches to seed sourcing and looking at seed zones in all these different ways because I don't know, we're still figuring it out. But I mean, I think when all else fails, if you are concerned about the potential impacts of how what moving seed might bring, I think that in my mind, local seed sourcing is kind of like the safest bet. I mean, you're not doing any, you're like essentially being like a natural disperser or bringing seeds back to the same environment from which they're adapted. So I think if there were major questions and you weren't sure, that might be the safest bet now until we get more information. I don't think there's any consensus that any particular seed sourcing strategy is like the best strategy for the future. If there is, I'm not an expert on seed sourcing or seed zones. I'd read a lot of papers and people have a lot of ideas and I found it all very interesting. But I think that one thing I have learned is that there's no unifying consensus about how to achieve or move forward in various restoration practice. There's a lot of different methods out there and people are trying a lot of different things. And I think we're in a point where we're trying to be as innovative as we can and do the best we can, but we don't have like a silver bullet or a solid answer.
All right. How about options for home gardeners? So home gardeners who have native plants, is there any way that they can contribute to like seed banks or to retail nurseries for native plants? Is there anything they can do?
I think honestly, like in the home garden, having native plants, especially if you live like in a very urban environment, like where I live in Los Angeles County, one thing we always find surprising I find surprising is that there's some plants that I didn't think were as arid adapted as they were. Like so for instance, I'm growing so Eriogonum cinereum is more a little bit of a coastal species. I have a hot inland garden that I don't water. And that thing is just like wild and thrives and just like is self-seeding. And I think if we're able to gather there, I don't know of a place, there should be a place where we're able to gather information from home gardeners to understand like how well plants are doing and what kind of conditions you provide for those like a home gardener like me who tortures their plants and doesn't water them at all, and like which plants are succeeding in my zone and what I've grown might provide important information for restoration practitioners. But I actually maybe Calscape or something, CNPS, I don't know, is Carolyn on here? But there are probably opportunities through organizations like CNPS to be able to share that horticultural knowledge that then might be useful to restoration practitioners as well.
All right, very interesting. So another question about seeds, of course. So when doing seed restoration, is the emphasis more on restoring the ecosystem in general or on maintaining specific species?
Well, I think it varies. I think there are some restoration projects that are very species specific focus, and that might be for something like a rare plant. So for instance, my team has been working on a restoration project for Nevin's barberry, Berberis nevinii, which is federally endangered. And it's a shrub, a chaparral shrub, and it's readily available in horticulture and easy to grow by seed, difficult to propagate by cuttings, but is very much declining in wild populations. And so the restoration project is really kind of centered around that species. But I think by and large, most restoration is really focused on ecosystems and thinking about plant communities, diverse plant communities, and enhancing habitat to support wildlife, to support the whole system. But it could go both ways.
All right. And Caroline Martorano responded, by the way, and said that that would be a great CNPS project. So we've got
Great.
that. All right, another question. Let me see here.
Very impressive questions, by the way.
We've actually got quite a few more, so I hope you're ready for this. So great presentation, Naomi. Thank you. Where will the seed transfer zone best practices be housed when the science becomes available? Is that going to go onto Calscape, on our website?
I don't know. I imagine that the agencies, the federal agencies, might have a lot to do with like how that might get disseminated out or what best practices are. So you can find a lot of seed transfer zone information on USGS and US Forest Service pages. And then the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, has done a lot of research in the Mojave Desert ecoregion and Great Basin region, I believe, for seed transfer zones. So a lot of the federal agencies are participating and facilitating a lot of the research. They might also be a good avenue for dispensing that information more broadly.
Great. Okay, a question about cuttings and clones. So what role should or do cuttings and clones play in restoration?
Well, sometimes seed propagation is really hard. So for instance, Manzanitas arctostaphylos can be really difficult to get those seeds to germinate. So in those cases, we might have to use stem cuttings. And so they do play a role for propagating plants, but obviously seed-based restoration relies on seed. And so they're just certain species that are very difficult. So certain salvias have very low seed production, or there might be various groups that just have low seed viability. And in those instances, it's going to be really, really hard to generate sufficient seed for seed restoration. I'd even talk about like species that have very low seed viability. And that might be, in terms of seed cultivation, maybe we might increase seed fill or viability, but then also I don't know how that translates to the adaptability of those seeds out in the landscape. But good question. And I think in certain instances, we do collect cuttings and we have to do vegetative propagation because that is what we have available.
Super. All right, another question. So various native plant species change the environment, in the restoration site. Are there guidelines or information about which species are necessary for restoring an ecosystem's integrity?
Well, it depends on the place, California, where I work, is a very diverse place, and you could be on one side of the slope and have one suite of species, and then just like hop on over to the other side of the slope, and it's a whole different situation. It just is very place-based, hard to know thing. It just really depends on where you're at.
Great. All right, next question. So what about plants with varieties with geographic boundaries? So they're thinking about Eriogonum fasciculatum varieties and acmespon that have been moved into areas that they had never before occurred or hadn't occurred. So how can we get those species on the radar of seed collectors?
Yes, that's very important. So for instance, Encilia farinosa has been widely moved outside of its range, where it's interfacing with other species like Encilia actini and Encilia californica, and those species are readily known to hybridize. And so I think it's really important for people to brush up and understand and know if we can get information out there about the native range of species, because I think there's a lot of people in Los Angeles County who think Encilia farinosa is native to here, and it's not. And maybe seed collectors think that, and they're going to collect the seed and put it back out and think it's local seed, and it's not. There are recommendations, for instance, in seeds of success collecting protocols, that you shouldn't collect seed alike along roadsides or from sites that have had seed introduced, because you're not necessarily getting wild seed. So that's why that is implemented in protocols. So it's like really important you understand the history of the site, what you're collecting, and making sure you're not collecting seeds of plants that have been introduced. And that would be also important for Eriogonum fasciculatum. There's an interesting study taking place at the California Botanic Garden related to Eriogonum fasciculatum, and thinking about plants in the urban environment and in the wild, and thinking about like what's more adapted for the urban environment. Is it the plants because Eriogonum fasciculatum will grow in like vacant lots, but then we have the question, is the plants in vacant lots, are they like local or were they introduced horticulturally? So then we can test that using a genetic study, and so that's where we're hopefully we'll be able to look at that. And that species, I think, will be a really interesting case study for that.
All right, sort of a related question, actually, this ended up. Is there an organization where seed sources of landscape plants is tracked? For instance, can parks that source seeds and plants from the wildlands be a future source of seeds? And if so, who will track where these urban sites sourced their seeds?
Is that for like in like the source of seeds in like more horticultural, like built environment?
I think they're talking about built environments, yeah. So in urban environments.
So one thing that I sort of lament, I mean, it's just, we only have so much time, is that a lot of plants in the horticultural trade, like the provenance is unknown. And so, they might be labeled like California native plant. Maybe that species spans California and Arizona, and maybe the source is from Arizona and it's actually not a California native plant. So there's just not a lot of information on provenance on a lot of horticulturally sourced plants, but there are initiatives amongst various botanical institutions to make locally sourced plants more readily available in the horticultural trade for regular people to buy. So for instance, Theodore Payne has a very excellent locally sourced initiative where people who shop at Theodore Payne can buy plants that they know came from the Verdugo Mountains, or plants that come from a specific local source, and so they can know they're planting local source plants. I participated in writing a inventory for the Verdugo Mountains, and so I had people using our floristic checklist as sort of guides for their garden, and they would buy locally sourced plants from the Theodore Payne. So I thought that was like a really great way for people in the built environment to think about where their plants come from, and really getting to those like local source, like getting hardcore about local source. And so I think we need more institutions doing that kind of work and telling us where our plants are coming from, but we don't, that's not by and large the practice.
Great. We had a comment just come in related to it that you're touching on so many questions that I've grappled with very little guidance. This is an amazing webinar. So very nice. All right, next question. Is there any data in the literature that you found on the interaction between seed source and pollination ecology? So specifically risks of phenology getting out of sync with local pollinator populations?
Yes. I mean, I didn't even touch on that with domestication syndrome, but that could be a big factor is thinking about pollination with respect to uniform flowering and with and pollinators that might not sync up with pollinators. I don't have additional information on that, but that is a big thing to think about, and that's an important point. So thank you.
Great. All right, another very interesting question. So there are farms in the San Joaquin Valley that need to fallow a lot of land in order to save on water usage, and they are looking into transitioning their farms into native seed production so that their land is still providing a crop, but it's more drought tolerant. Would it benefit the genetics of these native plants if the farms practiced more regenerative practices, or is it about transitioning every couple of years is what they ask?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great for bigger growers to get involved in sourcing native seed. I think that seed may, it might be hard to sort of, it's going to take a lot of work, probably. One is to get the farmers to grow the native plants, and just that's a big hurdle in itself, right? And so once they do, I think then imposing on them sort of like doing all these things to avoid domestication syndrome could be difficult. So I don't know, it might be that some of these larger seed farms are better for producing plants for the public rather than restoration, or if it's producing plants for restoration, maybe the restoration practitioner can work very closely with the farmer to identify a set of practices. It's very new territory in a lot of ways. So yeah, a lot to work out for sure.
All right. Question about pollination again. So a lot of native plant farms are located in big ag areas that are surrounded by non-native domestic honeybees that are generalist pollinators. Are there studies that prove honeybees are less effective pollinators for native plants than native bees?
Yes, I know that there is research that has come out that showed that honeybees are not as efficient pollinators as native bees, so their pollinator service isn't as effective. They also, unfortunately, can transfer disease to native bee populations. So that might be limiting and have the seed production of those farms if they're primarily being serviced by honeybees, but I don't know, but if there's other aspects of domestication syndrome, maybe they're not seeing big decrease, maybe they're still getting a lot of seed production, but one might wonder too if the viability of that seed. But I mean, they probably do a fair amount of pollination, but it might not be as efficient as a native pollinator.
Great. All right, so a question, do domesticated seeds of common species still have a place in restoration of degraded landscapes? For example, could they be used in conjunction with invasive species control?
I mean, yeah, I mean, I don't think that they maybe I'm not trying to advocate for like total elimination of seed farming or anything like that. I think that definitely has a role and it's important, and we need to find ways to innovate and make it a viable option for restoration. And like I mentioned earlier, there is this sort of gradation of like, built environment, degraded lands to like more restoration happening closer to much more intact ecosystems. And maybe along that gradient, there's seed from different sources there's different levels of suitability, right? From seed from different sources. I don't know. I wish I had all the answers.
Well, we've got more questions. And Naomi, we're going to go until 1:30, correct?
We have about 10 more.
Okay, so we may have to cut off the questions at some point, but I'm going to try to get through them all. So we'll try to
Never
do
had so many
a
questions
little
before.
bit
My
rapid
goodness.
fire. Yeah.
I don't know if I opened up a can of worms.
All right, so my next question. I didn't consider when collecting seeds that some genetic diversity could be lost if collected too early or too late. Is there a best way to get as much diversity as possible? Is it to collect from one population over multiple times?
Yeah, that is what you would do if you had the time. But we know that we have limited time in our seed collection. A lot of time our seed collection locations are far away, takes a long time to drive to. But ideally, you'd be collecting a small amount of seed at a lot of different points in time and getting that, you'd be maximizing your genetic diversity if you did that way. And it's also, how you spatially are sampling across the landscape. There's just lots of different, we do our best to try to maximize the genetic diversity that we capture. And for the most, I didn't summarize this in my talk, but there is a whole wealth of research looking at basically how much genetic diversity are we capturing with our seed collections. And in some instances, it's pretty good, like maybe getting 90% of the allelic variation. And maybe with certain species, it's harder. But a lot of times we're doing pretty good. And, my teams, I would say a lot of times we might be going out as much as 2 times, maybe sometimes 3, but like we're not able to like really go out there as frequently as you would like.
Okay, next. Will restoration plant material that is following seed zone protocols cost significantly more than, say, typical nursery stock? And if so, what kind of additional expense would you expect? Is it like 2 times the cost, 3 times the cost?
I don't have the cost breakdown. I really don't. I don't know the answer to that. Sorry.
No worries. Next question. Do you work with iNaturalist at all?
I'm on iNaturalist as an individual, but in terms of like scouting for seed populations, I mean, I think iNaturalist is a very informative data source. The thing that iNaturalist provides, so in all of our seed collections and our protocols, we collect herbarium specimens and we contribute to the herbarium record. iNaturalist, what it provides, herbarium specimens are a lot of work. They're important, but they're a lot of work, and not as many people are collecting herbarium specimens as much as they should be. And it takes a long time for the data, the herbarium specimens, to get into the databases. So for instance, we use the Consortium of California Herbaria. iNaturalist is like very quick. You snap a photo on your phone, you upload it to iNaturalist, maybe even the machine learning gives you a provisional identification. Like it's very gratifying, right? Like boom, observation. And so the benefit of iNaturalist is that you're able to get almost like real time information, and it can tell you about like the phenology of a population of species that you're tracking that year. So yeah, it's an important data source. It can tell you when species you're tracking are coming into flower, specific observations that were made, and then maybe they take a picture of the landscape, and then you get a sense of population abundance. You don't always get all that information. So I'm like a big advocate for herbarium specimens, don't get me wrong, but I'm just saying that yes, iNaturalist is a great complement to the information you can use in your seed scouting.
Great. Okay, next. So many of our native plants for the home garden come from the Channel Islands. What do you think about the distance that those plants and seeds have traveled?
Well, I mean, for restoration, those plants belong on the Channel Islands. I think that there are instances. So, okay, Eriogonum, oh my gosh. Oh, there's so many Eriogonums for the Channel Islands, and I am blanking right now. One of the Eriogonums for the Channel Islands that's like a rare plant is weedy on the mainland. So it can cause some issues, certainly when our plants in horticulture and cultivation escape and start to naturalize outside of their range.
All right, excellent. So specific to flowering plants and pollinator habitat restoration, is there research that considers the nutritional value of bulk seed and seed restoration sites as quality pollen and nectar sources for pollinators?
I did not see any of that literature when I did my review. No, I don't know. I mean, there may be, but I feel like that's a whole other line of research. yeah, looking at nectar quality and probably in wildlife journals. I don't know.
Okay, great. I think this is more of a comment than a question, but somebody has posed that more diverse clone collections could be a semi-replacement for seed collection.
Yeah, when we collect cuttings and we're doing vegetative propagation, we want to collect from as many mother individuals as we can.
Great. All right. Could agriculture implement more native cover crops that would help with grow outs and maybe seed collections? Or would this cause, do you think this would cause too much domestication syndrome in the cover crops?
I don't know that, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I mean, yeah, and then getting into yeah. I mean, there's like a whole there's a whole line of inquiry that one could investigate about the use of native plants in agricultural settings and having them being used as cover crops. When native plants are being used as cover crops, I think that's just an agricultural application of native plants, and it's, you know, on the gradient of restoration, it's definitely like use of plants in a more controlled environment. And it's an interesting thing, an important thing. I don't know enough about it.
Oh, thank you. Is there readily accessible testing to understand? Oops, let me make sure I've got this question right. Is there readily accessible testing for understanding the source, seed zone, or genetic variability of a seed source? And will this technology be available in the future?
The genetic variability. Well, there's the kind of testing that is done is mostly related to fill and viability. And I don't know of any genetic testing of seeds. I'm sure it could be done. Genetic testing in general tends to be more expensive, and so it might not be cost effective right now.
Okay, great. And do we have another minute? I'll ask like one more question. All right, what resources do you recommend for chaparral or coastal sage scrub? What resources do you recommend for chaparral or coastal sage scrub for restorations? And what's the best, place to go to get information about that?
Yeah, Arley's seed species profiles cover a lot of chaparral coastal sage scrub species. That link is going to be in my presentation that you can download those. That's really good information. The California Botanic Garden produced some propagation protocol profiles that with some grant funding through the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, working with the Angeles National Forest. And so we're kind of producing that as a booklet, and we'll be releasing that fairly soon. We just got to shore up the pagination and, get it ready to go out. Yeah, and I don't, it'd be nice to have a hub of information specifically for coastal sage scrub chaparral ecosystems. I think that is a place where there's a lot more research that can be done on these particular topics for those systems.
Great. All right, and last question, I think, of the day. So when you were doing your literature review and your research, are there any universities that stood out as undertaking, much of this research? So this is for budding academics.
Oh, wow. You know what? If you look at all the literature I sourced, it came from so many diverse institutes, so many different institutions from different states. So I didn't find one particular place where it was like, oh, this is clearly where this work is happening. Like it came out of a lot of different labs. And so I think a lot of people are thinking about these topics.
Okay, great. All right. So we didn't quite get to everybody's questions, but if you still have some, you are very welcome to email us. You can see in my name on here. So it also says the email address, registrar@calbg.org. So feel free to email that email address. We're also going to send out the follow-up email that will have once we get this recording up onto YouTube, it will be there. And then all of Naomi's sources, I believe, are going to go out on that email address as well. So there will be additional information. So feel free to reach out and let us know if you have additional questions. It seems like there's some more out there.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for being on.
Thank you all for being here today.
Yeah. All right. Bye.
All right. Enjoy your afternoon.